The New Testament reading this morning, the gospel reading is from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for reading for us today. You did a wonderful job, and we greatly appreciate that. I want you to tell me if you recognize this story, and I'm sure you will. A dog is walking home with a piece of meat in his mouth. On his way home, he crosses a river and looks into the water. He mistakes his own reflection for another dog, and he wants his meat also. But as he opens his mouth, the meat falls into the river and is never seen again. Do you recognize that story? Is it familiar with you? I bet you might even know where it came from. It is a story that's part of the many little morality tales bundled in an ancient collection that we call Aesop's Fables. Now, when is the last time that you read one of Aesop's fables? My guess would be that it probably was when you were a child, or when you were reading the stories to your children or your grandchildren. But these stories were written for adults and originated 2,600 years ago. And though the identity and even the existence of Aesop is debated, there is no disputing, no debate about the wisdom of these stories. A wisdom that we still wish to preserve and even share centuries later. We share a story like The Dog and the Shadow because its point is still as relevant to our lives today as it was in 525 BC, 500 years before Christ. Our hope would be that the wisdom of this story about greed, obviously it's about greed, would take hold in the human heart. But it hasn't happened yet, has it? Clearly, we still need this story. Perhaps even more today than when it was first written. The moral of this story has been applied by the scientific world as a behavioral characteristic of human beings known as hedonic adaptation. That sounds like a lot, but it's rooted in the word hedonism or hedonistic. Hedonic adaptation. That's a real thing. So what's that? The definition of hedonic adaptation is, quote, the observed tendency of humans to quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events or life changes. According to this theory, as a person makes more money, expectations and desires rise in tandem, which results in no permanent gain in happiness. Unquote. According to behavioral scientists, we are all on this thing that they call the hedonic treadmill, meaning that we keep a baseline level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction regardless of what happens to us in our lives. Good, we hope, or bad, which does happen. In other words, as one website put it, as I was doing my research, we are stuck in a happiness trap. As soon as we get what we perceive will make us completely happy, our dream come true, we find ourselves seeking something else. While hedonic adaptation is a scientific term, and by the way, a proven behavioral theory, it only reinforces the moral wisdom in the most ancient of spiritual principles. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female servant, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. You recognize that? You know where it comes from? I'm sure you did as soon as you heard the "you shall not." I remember many, many years ago when I learned the children's catechism. I remember that particular commandment was followed by a question. Here is the question. What does the 10th commandment teach us? And here was the answer. To be content with our lot. To be content with our lives. Now, I want you to know, I did have to look that up. I didn't remember that from that long ago. But once I read it, I remembered it. That commandment emerged out of the Hebrews' wilderness journey to the promised land. A journey characterized, as you might recall, by their constant complaints against God and against Moses. You remember that in Egypt, the children of Abraham pined for their freedom from slavery. And God heard their cry. And who did God send to them? Moses. He sent Moses to liberate them from their slavery. And Moses did. But as the story in Exodus teaches us, the bondage of Israel revealed itself to be not just a physical bondage, but an emotional bondage. And sometimes that kind of bondage binds us tighter than anything else. As soon as God led the people into Sinai, into the desert, they demanded for Moses to return them to Egypt. Why? Why did they want to go back to slavery? Well, they did not have to forage for water or food or conserve their resources. It's hard to travel, and it's hard to be in a wilderness area. Even when God provided the miracle of the manna from heaven, the bread from heaven, and the water from the rock, the people were still not satisfied, to the point of plotting violence against Moses. It is that's the beauty of the Old Testament. It doesn't hold back. It doesn't make saints out of these people. They're human beings just like us, and they struggle with the same things that we do, including anger. Some of the major themes from this story that we read in Exodus of Israel's habitual dissatisfaction in the wilderness appear in John's story of the feeding of the 5,000. While it is, interestingly enough, Jesus' one miracle that is shared by all four Gospels, the only one, each one has a different perspective, each Gospel, and a different setting. Even the different size of crowds. I think the smallest is 3,000. The most is here in John with 5,000. John, this is really interesting, doesn't even use the Greek word for miracle. He uses the word semeia, which means sign. Sign. And John never uses the word miracle. He always used the word sign for the things that Jesus did. Think about that. Why did John use that word? A miracle happens to the praise of God and the glory of the Messiah. But a sign has a message. It has a message for those who experience it in that real time, and it has a message for we who read about it. A sign points you toward something else, a deeper truth. So what is that message in this story of the feeding of the multitude? After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Right away, John identifies, as you noted, Jesus' power to heal as a sign rather than a miracle. But as we are about to see, the interpretation of that sign is clearly different in its perception than in its intent. We're going to see a difference. The crowds were either coming to Jesus to be healed or coming to witness his healing power. I realized something while I was just sitting there listening to Ruth read the passage again. Every time I hear the passage, something new pops up. And I realized something. John points out that it was the Passover of the Jews. And I kept going, why does John mention that? It's got no part of this story. And then I realized, during Passover, there were thousands of people on the roads in the wilderness. And they would have heard about Jesus. So it makes sense that there was this huge crowd coming out to see what he was about. I didn't realize that until I heard that passage again. The crowds were either coming to Jesus to be healed or they were coming to witness his healing power. And their motives for persistently following him do not appear at the beginning to be much deeper than that. They needed something. They thought Jesus, maybe as a faith healer, could give them something. As Jesus seats himself and his disciples at the top of a grassy hill, they see this massive crowd coming toward them in a deserted area, a place where they can offer no provision for their own needs or for the crowd's needs. Jesus initiates this sign by asking his disciples a question. Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? Now, Jesus knows the answer to that question. He knows what he can do, and he knows what he's going to do. But he wants to see, I think he wants to see how his followers, his disciples, are thinking at that moment. What are they thinking? How are they thinking about him? Have the disciples yet to understand who Jesus really, really is? Well, the answer seems to be not yet. Not yet. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people? Now, it's interesting to me that Philip's answer is very practical, very level-headed. Whatever money the group had to provision themselves, it wasn't nearly enough to feed 5,000 people. This event takes place not too long after Jesus and the disciples journeyed into Samaria, where Jesus encountered, as you may recall the story, the Samaritan woman at the well. And you might recall that that encounter took place while the disciples, all of them, went into the nearest village to purchase food, and Jesus was left there by himself. That's what they did. Up until this time, the disciples were pretty much limited to these responsibilities. But on that Galilean hillside, things began to change for Jesus' followers. The change is epitomized in the difference between the impossibility of Philip's solution to the needs of the crowd and the possibility hidden within Andrew's statement. There is a boy here, 5 barley loaves, 2 fish, but what are they among so many people? Andrew isn't looking at what the disciples can obtain to feed the crowd, but what they already have at hand. A ridiculously small amount of food, and most importantly, what Jesus can do with it. The little boy is there, just a child. His meal is meager, enough for him, perhaps his family, but not for 5,000. And it, to me, is touching. It has always touched my heart. How the anonymous child was willing to hand over what he has to Christ. And once he does, Christ does the rest, right? Jesus said, make the people sit down. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. In having the disciples seat the crowd, Jesus accomplishes 2 things. He brings the disciples into direct contact with those who are seeking Jesus, whatever their purpose was for seeking Jesus. And in that moment, he creates a community that is about to have an amazing shared experience of God's presence. Now, John does not go into detail as to how the 5 loaves and 2 fish become enough to satisfy thousands of hungry people. But he does show us how Jesus performs the sign. First, Jesus gives thanks to God in the traditional blessing before the meal. Then he distributes the food to the crowd himself. He comes close to each one of them. brings them the food. He does it. According to John, this is Jesus' first hands-on miracle that we see. In this way, John connects the sign of the feeding of the 5,000 directly to the feeding of God's people in the wilderness. Because who fed them? Moses didn't do it. Moses didn't feed them or give them water. God himself gave them the food. God gave them the water. So John here is consciously making that connection. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Now, the crowd responds to the sign with two mistaken conclusions, and we just heard the first one. And then we read the second mistaken conclusion. When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. In these two conclusions by the astonished crowds, we see a reflection, at least in my opinion, of what I described earlier as hedonic adaptation. The crowd had been fed, not just to assuage their hunger, but to their complete satisfaction. In itself, think about what a thing that was to celebrate in a time when it was hard to get enough food to eat, to fill you up, to survive, yes, but to fill you up, very difficult. Through Jesus, God had provisioned the people beyond their need to their complete satisfaction, and even had some left over to give to others later. But others in the crowd go even further and identify Jesus as the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, this is probably a reference to Deuteronomy 18:15, when Moses declares, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. From among your own people you shall heed such a prophet." Now, this promised prophet was interpreted in many ways in the time of Christ, but not as the Messiah. It was the prophets themselves in the Old Testament who predicted the Messiah as a unique identity with a unique purpose. The Messiah and the prophet were different. In fact, many said that John the Baptist was the prophet of which Moses spoke. It is doubtless that in their struggle to understand Jesus' identity, the disciples might have included this prophet as a possibility. Remember, they're struggling with who Jesus is. They're struggling. But an even more dangerous conclusion by some in the crowd follows. That Jesus is the promised king of Israel. Now think how dangerous that was. Passover is going on. Passover, where Jesus was crucified. And here they have their king, and they are going to drag him to Jerusalem. And then it's on. That's what they were going to do. That was their plan. It is this politically driven, messianic identity of the Messiah as king, as the inheritor of King David's throne, that would fuel the conspiracy to kill Jesus and his followers just a few years later, when Jesus did go to Jerusalem at the Passover. Jesus had united the crowd. Jesus had united his followers with himself in a sign pointing to God's providential love, God's overwhelming love that Jesus enabled. But those sinful hearts, like ours, would not be satisfied with the reality of the Messiah's purpose. Think about it. Just like today, many want to create Jesus in their own image. And they want to create Jesus in their own image in order to meet their agendas. We see it every day. It's one of the great, great sins of the church. And that is why John tells us that Jesus withdrew from the crowd and later called on his disciples to withdraw with him. And they do. Basically, Jesus escapes. He runs. Because they're going to drag him to Jerusalem. When we miss the point of the Messiah's purpose, as we do, who can argue with this, the fact that we create so much suffering and so much sorrow? But when we embrace the point of the Messiah's purpose, the point that Jesus made himself in this sign, when we do that, God's providential love flows through us and out of us into the world. But it is a costly love. It cost Jesus on the cross, and it cost we who follow Jesus. Theologian Arthur McGill says that this love is in complete opposition to self-love. That's the love we like. That's the love we're familiar with. And our own desire for personal satisfaction. Christ's love transforms us into a people as needy as those whose need we seek to satisfy. This is the point McGill makes. I'll quote it. As a Christian, I often speak of love as helping others. But I ignore what this does to the person who loves. Love is self-expenditure, a real expending and losing and deterioration of self. We hear it said, since you have no unanswered needs, why don't you go out and help those other people who are in need? But we never hear people go on and add, if you do this, you too will be driven into need. He concludes with these words. Those who love in the name of Jesus Christ serve the needs of others willingly, even to the point of being exposed in their own neediness. At the center of their life, the very innermost center, they are grateful to God because they do not fear neediness. That is what frees them, liberates them to serve the needy, to companion the needy, to become and be one of the needy. Unquote. Think about this. If Christ can take 5 loaves and 2 fishes, selflessly surrendered by a child, and feed thousands with more to spare, how much can he do with us, with our lives, if, like that child, we are willing to surrender all we have to him? Our time, our talents, our blessings to him. A short time later, in John's Gospel, Peter finally understands the point of the loaves and the fishes when he declares Christ as the Messiah, the Son of God, and nothing and no one else. So do we get the point? you and I? Are we going to allow our lives to be driven by hedonic adaptation? Are we going to get off the hedonic treadmill? Or are we going to let Christ drive our lives for the sake of his purposes and his needs? Are we going to become the bread that feeds the world? Thomas Merton wrote these beautiful words. To say that I am made in the image of God is to say that love is the reason for my existence. For God is love. Love is my true identity. Selflessness is my true self. Love is my true character. Love is my name. If, therefore, I do anything, or think anything, or say anything, or know anything that is not purely for the love of God, it cannot give me peace, or rest, or fulfillment. What Burton says is so true. And it is the only way for us to get off the hedonic treadmill. The love of Christ is the only way to the place where we are more than satisfied. That keeps us from having to search anymore in this world for a satisfaction that we're never going to find. Because Christ is the answer to every need. Isn't that why we're here? Amen. Our hymn that you're invited to stand and sing